Hi, everyone. I'll bang my gavel here just for the benefit of everybody in the room. Apologies for starting not only late, but starting with sound. We've had the proverbial technical difficulties here, which has delayed the press conference by half an hour. Actually, Maria, our speaker, was talking and we couldn't hear her. So I will reboot the entire press conference, including the introduction, my introduction. Well, last week at a court in Manila, our speaker today, Maria Ressa, was found guilty of the crime of cyber libel. The news website that she runs, Rappler, has made a name for itself by scrutinizing human rights abuses and alleged corruption by President Rodrigo Duterte and his government. Duterte and his allies, in an echo of the attacks on the media elsewhere, have branded Rappler's reports fake news and launched what Ressa and others describe as a vindictive campaign of legal intimidation, which is designed to shut them down. She has been convicted along with a former writer and editor called Ronaldo Santos Jr. The convictions have been widely condemned as an attack on press freedom. Amal Clooney, who leads her legal team, accused the court of being complicit in a sinister action to silence a journalist for exposing corruption and abuse. Peter Grest, director of the Alliance for Journalist Freedom, called the conviction an extraordinarily damaging precedent for press freedom. Reza herself, after the conviction, told the court that the Philippines is at the precipice. If we fall over, we're no longer a democracy, she said, referring to Rappler, of course. Well, she is going to describe her case to us here today and the background, what's going on in the Philippines, and then we will have some questions. Maria, my apologies again. We couldn't hear you, but I believe we can hear you now.
Thank you. Thanks, David. And no problem. All of these things happen, right? I guess let me start first with, what the last 4 years have been like, because essentially the attacks that started online in 2016 with government attacks in 2017, 2018, the weaponization of the law, and now this kind of insidious online attacks have been verified, have with a guilty with a verdict like this, it now shows that this narrative that was seeded on social media in 2016, meaning Maria Ressa is not a journalist, she's a criminal, or journalist equals criminal, is now true, right? So I want to put it in that context, I think, and kind of quickly go over in 2016, soon after President Duterte was elected, Rappler began doing two series that earned the government's ire. The first was to challenge the brutal drug war, the level of impunity. In fact, we called it the Impunity Series. This is a drug war that, according to our own Commission on Human Rights, has killed at least 27,000 people. But according to the police, their official numbers is more than 6,000. Right? Regardless, 6,000 or 27,000. This is this is horrific. The second level of impunity that we challenged was something from what we called the Propaganda War series. And this first three-part series we published in 2016 showed that our government was actively manipulating public opinion, manipulating Filipinos. And what we did here is two of the three-part series I wrote. The first was weaponizing the internet. The second was how Facebook algorithms impact democracy. And then the third is manufactured consensus. This is this idea that if you see a lie a million times, it creates a bandwagon effect and makes it a fact. Essentially what happened with journalist equals criminal, then official lines, and now we have our judiciary chiming in and cementing an insidious attack. 2016, at least 90 hate messages per hour against me personally and against Rappler. Those exponential attacks were then followed in 2017 by government, top down. So first bottom up, then top down. President Duterte himself, in his State of the Nation address, said that Rappler was owned by foreigners. And while I tweeted, Mr. President, you're wrong, a week later, we got our first subpoena. That's 2017. In 2018, January, the government gave us, essentially tried to shut us down by revoking our license to operate. This cyber libel case that you saw was the second case that was filed against us in 2018, a year that had 11 investigations conducted by the government against me and against Rappler, against our board of directors, right? Roughly the three buckets: cyber libel, the second one is tax evasion, and the third is securities fraud. So the tax evasion one is funny because the first tax charges came 6 months after the government gave us an award for being a top corporate taxpayer. So, it doesn't matter what happened before. This is what the government says. Let me zoom in on this case itself, on cyber libel. There's two major points in this. Essentially, because one of our Rapplers changed a typographical error, a misspelling on the word is evasion. They changed one letter in that word. And because of that, Ray and I can go to jail for up to 6 years. The two main points our lawyers have brought up is that this case should never even have gone to court. In fact, that echoes what the NBI, our FBI, our equivalent of the FBI, their lawyers threw it out, saying that it is already beyond the period of prescription. So in order to bring this case to court and to be able to convict me and Ray, the government had to accept that they would change the period of prescription, the statute of limitations for libel, from 1 year, which is what it says in our Constitution, in our laws, to 12 years. That will now impact every single Filipino. The second is based on that typographical error, a concept, it's new. I'm a test case for a lot of things, apparently, but this concept of republication, the government has used this concept of continuing crime against a lot of its perceived critics. In this case, they got around the retroactive application of a law, because when we first published this story, the law we allegedly violated hadn't been in place yet. They got around that by saying that in 2014, we republished. They also conveniently forgot that at that time, there was a TRO on this law. It wasn't yet in effect because it had been challenged at the Supreme Court by groups like us. So that's where it is. And I think the last thing I'll say is that David Kaye, the UN's Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression, actually weighed in on this case, on these on freedoms of on the freedom of speech, the freedom of the press. And I think the only thing the judge said about it, this is the Montesa court, said was noted, and then went on to look at processes of journalism instead of the very clear points that needed to be hurdled in order to even bring the case to court. Those two that I mentioned, the statute of limitations and republication. We're going to be challenging this, of course. I continue to hope for justice. It is only 1 out of 8 criminal charges that I face. Okay, so after 2018, those 11 cases, then 2019, the government then took me to court, right? 8 criminal charges. Rappler and I have paid more in bail and bonds than Imelda Marcos, who's been convicted in 4 different countries. I've been arrested twice in a 5-week period and detained once, a way to make me feel the government's power. What that did to me is to unshackle me and to make me realize that my rights as a Filipino have been abused and that the law has been weaponized to try to cut down on freedom of the press, to try to silence independent journalism that tries to hold power to account.
Thank you, Maria. And just so we understand your legal predicament, you face 6 years in prison. You're appealing it. When does the final appeal end? Or can you keep postponing it?
It's not a matter of postponing, because this libel case is one of the fastest. My lawyer here is a former Supreme Court spokesman, and he said that most libel cases last a minimum of a year to years. In fact, there's one that I know is more than a decade. It's still ongoing, but this particular one was very fast. So it's unclear how long it will take, but here's what we have still ahead of us. So this is a regional trial court. We can bring it back up to the judge, to the Montesa court. We can also appeal at the Court of Appeals, and then that's its own process, and then we can bring it up to the Supreme Court after that. Obviously, the period of prescription. That these are huge underpinnings to be able to convict us of the case and of cyber libel, and will have an impact beyond journalists. This will impact every Filipino who posts on Facebook, for example. Now they post something and they can cite Judge Montesa's decision to say that 12 years ago you posted this, and then be able to sue them.
Right. But you do think it's possible that you will serve jail time? Nobody wants to go that far, but
No, of course, David, like, I'm not a fool, and I've kind of I've prepared for the worst, but I continue to hope for the best, because I think that uh, it's not just me on trial. I'm coming up on my 35th year as a journalist, and I have not changed anything in the way I do work. In fact, I hope I've gotten much better. But you push back against things like this, and it's shocking that my nation is at this juncture. And in that sense, thank you to you and the other journalists who are listening for helping us shine the light, because that's the only weapon I really have to fight back right now.
sure. Well, we have other journalists who have lined up to ask you questions. So let me put the first one to you. These are online questions from people who are watching. The first one is from Jesse Johnson of the Japan Times. He says, "What's your view of press freedoms in Japan? And do you think Trump's disdain for the media has in any way impacted how governments, including Tokyo, deal with the media?" So there's two questions there.
I think what we're going through in the Philippines has an impact all around the world. And if you look at what's happening in the Philippines and what's happening in the United States, they're almost parallel right now, although our institutions are significantly weaker, right? Part of what puts all of us on the same boat is technology. Technology has been the enabler of the rise of populist authoritarian style leaders like my president. And it has also significantly altered the information ecosystem. Journalists are no longer the gatekeepers. Social media platforms are. Facebook is the world's largest distributor of news. And when that happens, when they strip away the gatekeeping role but abdicate responsibility, you get this ecosystem where a lie laced with anger and hate spreads faster than facts. Facts are really boring. We know this as journalists. We spend our entire careers learning how to tell riveting stories, the best stories we can tell, so that people will care. Well, imagine if you don't have to tell the truth anymore. And this is essentially what the social media platforms are doing. I also think of social media platforms as behavioral modification systems. And I'll focus on the Philippines and the United States, right? It's like throwing a virus, and I'm cognizant of the pandemic now that we are all facing, but it's like introducing a virus into the information ecosystem. Let's call it the virus of lies. And it infects lots of real people to a certain level that now they begin to believe the lies, and they won't, even if you fact check something, they won't care, because that's the cognitive bias. That is what polarizes our world. We certainly see that. I'll give you an example in the United States. The Mueller report has actually documented that Russian disinformation networks targeted Americans in the 2016 campaigns. And the US Senate Intelligence Committee released data that showed the IRA, the Internet Research Agency, working hand in hand with the Russian military intelligence, GRU, to pound a fracture line of society open. What is that? Black Lives Matter. So you fast forward 4 years and you can see where the United States is today. It is like in the Philippines, death by 1,000 cuts, right? Instead of healing divisions, social media allows you to pound it until it splits wide open. In terms of Japan, I will say I'm so sorry. I don't know enough about what you are going through. But if you are on social media, you will have the same excesses to deal with that we are dealing with today.
Thank you. You did mention Facebook. You said that Facebook, almost 100% of Filipinos are on there, and this was a huge factor in the campaign against you. Presumably, what you mean there is what you've just been discussing, that these kind of lies get spread on Facebook, and then it's too difficult to rein them in. Is that what you mean?
Uh, yes, in a nutshell, yes, but think about it like this, right? 100% of Filipinos on the internet are on Facebook. So, you know, Myanmar, for example, puts Facebook on every phone, or it did. In the Philippines, 100% penetration of everyone on the internet. You're talking about roughly 72 million Filipino accounts on Facebook. And when they hear or see me being pounded with this narrative of she is a criminal, 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 eliminate journalists, replace with criminal, and then the government says the same thing and comes top down, it changes reality, right? And that's targeted. It's targeted against journalists, not just me and Rappler. Um, Let me put this in context because I sound like I'm only talking about myself or Rappler. Uh, Three things happened in the since the beginning of the year. I think the first, like everyone around the world, we had to deal with a pandemic, this lockdown. The Philippines is now in Manila. We're in our 14th week of a lockdown. They've eased some restrictions, but this lockdown was so militaristic and security driven that in April, when President Duterte did this late night nationwide address, he told Filipinos stay at home. And then he told the police publicly that if they come out, if they violate quarantine rules, he said, and this is his quote, shoot them dead, which did happen. Tens of thousands were arrested. So there's that. There's a pandemic lockdown. People have been cooped up in their homes. The second thing is, and this is unthinkable, the shutdown of the largest broadcasting station in the Philippines, ABS-CBN. This is a network that employs 11,000 people. I used to manage its news groups. Its news group. It was the reason I first came home to the Philippines in 2005. The news group is 1,000 people strong. So if you see a scale, right, 1,000 journalists in ABS-CBN, 100 journalists in Rappler. Um, about a month ago, on May 5th, just like with Rappler, a minor regulatory agency gave them a shutdown cease and desist order. And within hours, ABS-CBN went dark. The last time that happened was in 1972 when Ferdinand Marcos declared martial law, and it took 14 years before ABS-CBN was able to open again. The third thing that I think is so worrisome and why I feel like we're just on the edge of democracy being crippled permanently is the passage of an anti-terror bill. It passed our House of Representatives in about 5 days' time. It's already passed our Senate before that. It is waiting at the office of the president for the president's signature. It's 2 weeks ago. This this bill, will allow cabinet secretaries, a small group, to essentially designate any critic a terrorist. Once they do that, you could be arrested without a warrant and held in jail, detained for up to 24 days. This is very alarming. And I think in the context of all of this, the verdict that we received last Monday, a week ago today, takes on greater proportions. This isn't just about freedom of the press. This is about Philippine democracy.
Right. Maria, our next question is from the Nikkei Asian Review. The journalist's name is Andy Sharp. Andy asks, could you have done a better job in 2012 when the article that was a source of the judgment last week was first published, or again in 2014 when it was republished with the typo that you mentioned in your introduction?
I think, let me just be categorical in this. In 2012, that story is 100% accurate. And in terms of what could we have done a better job? I mean, could we have imagined a law that would be created months later and that it could be used against us? You know, strangely enough, we did imagine that. That's why we campaigned against the cybercrime law. And that's why the Supreme Court issued a temporary restraining order, which was in place in 2014 when we fixed a typographical error. Let me just rephrase that question for you and then put you in my shoes, Andy. Imagine if, for whatever reason, you fixed a typographical error. And let's just say, even if there's something that may have gone wrong in a process, uh, should you go to jail for 6 years? That, of course, is the next question. We can't even get there because our lawyers just looked at it in terms of whether it's legal to even entertain the case in court. Having said that, of course, no one is perfect, and we constantly try to do better. The person who was in charge of that story testified in court. Really, really interesting that the Judge Montesa, dismissed her testimony as, in her words, hearsay. How can you say that?
Thank you. And Andy's second question is, what in your view was the reason for Wilfred Okengo waiting 5 years before filing the case in 2017?
I think that's more a question for Mr. Kang, but I just thought the timing, what we see is, one of the things that has been stated by his lawyers and by Mr. Kang is that they issued a PDEA, another intelligence report. And I think, I tweeted this. The person who signed that intelligence report was himself being investigated for corruption linked with luxury cars. So again, I don't even want to go, because in the hierarchy of the cases, this case was dismissed by the NBI's own lawyers. So I don't want to. I understand if Mr. Kang is what he says he is. The documents that we saw showed that may not be true, but I can't also say that. I think Mr. Kang has his rights. Why did he wait 5 years? I ask the same question. If he really cared about his reputation, maybe he should have done it as soon as it was published, in which case the senior reporter who also worked on this case would have been able to answer. This is another, Aris Rufo, who is a senior reporter with Rappler, also worked on this story. I think the other part that you can't ignore are the business and political ties. But again, lest I be charged with libel again, please go check it out, right. Because there is also another instance now where Mr. Kang is demanding that I take down a retweet of a 2002 article in the Philippine Star. I didn't even write any of it, but he is right. demanding that I take this down or else he'll sue me.
Wow. We have a question here in the room for you, Maria. The person standing at the microphone, would you not forget to introduce yourself if you don't mind? Thanks very much.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
So yes, my name is Ariel Buzetto, and I'm a journalist at the Japanese side, at the English side of Sankei Shimbun, Japanese newspaper. I wanted to ask you two questions. First of all, I wanted you to confirm that whether you see this case basically as a watershed compared to all the other 8 criminal charges that have been moved against you. And then second of all, what you would like to see, perhaps, what message would you like to send to Japan, both to regular people following this case, but also perhaps to policymakers? Would you like to see any pressure perhaps coming from the Japanese side regarding this case? Thank you.
Thanks.
It is a watershed for me, for Philippine journalists. And I would say this isn't even the first one. I think the one that really rang the alarm bells is the shutdown of ABS-CBN. Imagine if your largest network, because they displeased your top executive, your leader, is shut down. That's essentially what has happened here. And again, there's a veneer of rule of law. It's a veneer, but the reality is, in 2016, President Duterte threatened to take away the franchise of ABS-CBN, and in 2020, they did. The same thing here, right? So, and in terms of policymakers, I think we all know this, and probably part of the reason you're even interested in my case, in what's happening in the Philippines. There has never been a more dangerous time to be a journalist. And I'm much older than I look. I first became a reporter in 1986. So it's in all that time, I covered the transition to democracy of many of the Southeast Asian countries. I reported in Japan. I was just talking to David about this during the time of Murayama, right? The sarin gas attacks were my stories. I've reported from many different parts of the world, but never ever have I been confronted with a basic question I think every person in a democracy should answer. And this is the question: how far are you willing to go to protect the facts? What are you willing to sacrifice for truth? Because facts and truth, they're under attack. And a lot of that is enabled by social media, but this is something I told the Filipino people when the verdict was handed down. And of course, even though I was prepared for it mentally, it still hits you like a punch in your gut, right? So a few minutes, I walked out and I appealed to Filipinos. If you don't protect your rights, you will lose it. Every generation will craft their own democracy. Democracy isn't static. And if we don't protect it, we will lose it.
And the second question, I believe, was whether you would welcome political support from Japan, from the government here for your struggle.
Thank you, David, for reminding me. I've been a little overwhelmed by the support we have gotten all around the world. I think partly because they see shadows of themselves in us. Yes, absolutely. But, I wonder if me saying that could even be grounds for the government to file another case against me. Let me say it this way. Thank you for your support. I feel like we are fighting for basic rights enshrined in our Constitution. I am nothing but a journalist. My track record shows that. Rappler holds power to account, and that is the reason we've been singled out.
Thank you. The next question is from the South China Morning Post, and the writer's name is Anthony Rowley. How much does it help to have overseas press organizations such as our one, the FCCJ here in Japan, and others offer support by way of issuing statements and so on? I believe the FCCJ Freedom of the Press Committee did issue a statement in support of you last week. And are there other ways in which you feel that such organizations might help you?
First, thank you for the support. And yes, I think these things matter because in many ways, what we see during this, the line that I have been using for the last 4 years is hold the line, right? This is the line where our Constitution says these are our rights. And then what we're seeing is a really concerted effort to barrel us back. If we give up our rights voluntarily, we won't get them back. Your support has helped me stay out of prison, I guess. And certainly if I wind up going to prison, please help. I've had to embrace my fear in order to keep going because I feel like there is so much at stake for Filipinos. How else can you help us? The other way that the government has launched this is it's a war of attrition. And this is happening to ABS-CBN right now. They're losing anywhere from 30 to 35 million pesos a day that they've been shut down. And they've already said that they will soon have to let go of their people. In Rappler's case, we were forged in fire. The last 4 years have made us even more convinced that we are on the right track to protect our freedoms, but also our community has gathered around us. We started a crowdfunding campaign for legal fees because imagine we're only a small group of 100 people, and all of a sudden, a third of that operating budget has to go to pay legal fees. So if you Google Rappler crowdfunding, you'll see a link. That would be one. But journalists are journalists. You help us by shining the light. So please continue. Thank you so much for the stories you do. It keeps us safe.
Just for the benefit of people who don't know, Maria, would you be kind enough to explain Rappler's finances? So obviously you have been smeared by, as you said in your introduction, by the Duterte government as foreign owned. Would you just briefly explain how you're
Sure.
supported?
Sure. Rappler is a startup. Well, now we're coming up into our ninth year. But when I started it in 2012 with a group of, there are four of us, four women. We're all now in our late 50s. But when we started, we were much younger. We started with nothing. We started with 12 people, which is a mix of folks like us who have investigative journalism backgrounds, television and print, and then we embrace technology. Um, we raised money for ourselves, so from ourselves. So we raised about $2 million to kick it off. And my plan always was that we would break even in 5 years' time. And I thought that was interesting because most traditional news groups break even in 10 years' time. That I thought was the impact of technology. We were able to bring in two international support investors. They're called Philippine Depository Receipt holders. They don't own stocks, but they put in money. And if when we start to make money, they will get money. But according to our constitution, no foreigner can have anything to do with media. So all the major news groups, ABS-CBN, GMA7, the top news television stations, they all have something called Philippine Depository Receipts. We had two. One group is made up of, it's called North Base Media. It's made up of the former editor-in-chief, managing editor of the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, Marcus Broccoli, and then the other one is Omidyar Network. At that point, Omidyar Network is the philanthropic arm of, well, it's philanthropic and it's a startup. It tried to jumpstart. What we've done since 2012 is actually move from advertising over to a different sustainable business model. And this is where I will thank the attacks of the government. Imagine this in 2018, when the government slammed us with 11 cases that they were investigating us on. By April 2018, advertisers got scared because we were also getting exponentially attacked on social media. In fact, by April, we dropped 49% of our advertising revenue. So we needed to sit down and come up with a different sustainable business model. And what we did is we took what investigative journalists do. We took how we were investigating disinformation networks on social media, and we actually then gave a methodology to our sales team to then be able to create a B2B model. Now we have a far more diversified revenue stream, and we've actually come out stronger, forged in fire. While I don't wish it on you, it's not all bad. It forces you to be stronger, more creative, and more agile.
Thank you. We have one more question from our online audience. This one is from Dan Sloan, who's a freelance journalist. You've covered some of this before, Maria, but I'll read it again. What is the horizon for democracy in the Philippines after President Duterte quits or retires or wherever he goes? Have a lack of checks and balances left the country on a turn back to the strongman and military police state?
Isn't that so depressing, right? I became a journalist when People Power, soon after People Power happened. And I thought that come 35 years after it, we would have a vibrant democracy with strong institutions. Instead, what we're seeing is, let me phrase it this way. I talk about the three C's: corrupt, coerce, co-opt. Corrupt, coerce, co-opt. If you don't fall under any of these three C's, you become an enemy and you become targeted. For every single sector, business, politics, media, journalism, there's a cautionary tale that's been made. Obviously, please remember Senator Laila de Lima. She's the cautionary tale for politics. She was jailed in February 2017, not really much of a formal trial. She's been jailed without bail, and she is now asking for that. She's still in prison 3 years later. oh gosh, where's Philippine democracy going to go? Let me talk about from 1986. Coming in 1986 as a reporter, it took the Philippine police a decade after Marcos to put in place the human rights uh, culture that is necessary to be accountable, right? The UN Declaration of Human Rights the Philippines is one of the first signatories of that. So that was a decade. I think what we're seeing now, the caving in of institutions, um, this is the next generation. We will have to fix this in the next generation. And the sooner we get to it, the sooner we wake up and demand that these safeguards, that our rights again be put in place, the better it will be. Right now, I can't tell you what it's going to look like. It's a whole new world. Here, I guess the last part is we have elections. We elected President Duterte. He is our duly elected president. And in that, I give him the respect the office demands. But in the end, it is up to Filipinos. And we do, in the end, get the government we deserve.
Thank you very much, Maria. Just before we go, you did mention that you've been the recipient of large amounts of hate mail. Presumably you feel personally under threat, do you? Not just the threat of going to prison, but the threat of something worse. Just do you want to put that on the record?
Yeah, of course. I have said this. Look, when the exponential hate online, when there is inciting to hate, and we know this from all the studies and from the terrorist attacks that have happened in other parts of the world, when this happens, online hate, online violence leads to real world violence. So in 2016, when my young team, the median age in Rappler is 23 years old, we're 63% women. Women, according to our data, are attacked 10 times more than men in the Philippines in terms of sexist attacks and misogynistic attacks. What we did immediately was to kind of try to get psychological counseling, but the weapon was so new that we actually had to kind of train the trainers. DART came in to train the trainers in how we do this. And then simultaneously, it skipped out into the real world. And you'll see this in a documentary film. We had Ramona Diaz, a filmmaker, shadow us for almost a year and a half. And you can see there was one point, February last year, when the pro-Duterte supporters came to our office and incited violence on a live stream. They doxed our office address. They told people to come to the office. We had threats like behead them, line them up in a firing squad and shoot them dead. And at that point, we weren't sure what the police was going to do. They called people out to come. Well, so what did I do? I increased security 6 times. I'm not naive. And yes, it's there. But again, you can't let a Damocles sword over your head determine how you're going to act. It's important that we swat it away and keep going, but put in place the safeguards that are necessary given the context of the times.
Well, Maria, thanks so much for coming to talk to the FCCJ and for enduring not just our technical difficulties, but for dredging up all that horror that you have endured. We wish you the best, of course. Stay safe. We will endeavor to keep supporting you as an institution. The FCCJ is an institution of free journalism, and your video of this press conference will be up very shortly. Maybe that'll help. Thank you
Thank you
so
so
much.
much. Thanks,
We'll stay in
David,
touch.
FCCJ.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.